The harbour of Genoa is never truly still, even before dawn breaks. The water already carries motion wooden hulls groaning against stone piers, ropes tightening in the cold air, and the low voices of sailors preparing ships that have no intention of waiting for daylight. Lanterns flicker across wet decks, reflecting in the black surface of the Ligurian Sea like broken pieces of fire drifting away from shore. It is here, in this restless edge between land and ocean, that Christopher Columbus begins his life, not as a figure of history yet, but as a child absorbing the rhythm of a city built entirely on departure and return. Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, it helps more than you might think in bringing these forgotten worlds back into view. Genoa in the mid-15th century is not a quiet place of reflection or scholarship. It is a machine of commerce. Merchants argue in narrow streets that smell of salt, wool, and tar. Foreign languages overlap in the marketplaces: Catalan, Arabic, French, fragments of Greek, each one carried by sailors who arrive briefly and leave again before their names are remembered. Wealth moves through the city like water through a net, constantly shifting, never fully controlled, always slipping toward the next voyage. In this environment, a young boy growing up near the port learns very early that the world is larger than what he can see, but also that it is divided by distance, danger, and opportunity. Columbus is believed to be born into a modest family of woolworkers or small-scale merchants, though even this detail remains slightly uncertain in the historical record. What survives suggests a household close enough to the sea that its sounds are never absent. The creak of masts becomes as familiar as church bells. The smell of pitch and salted wood replaces the scent of farmland or forest that might define inland childhoods. In Genoa, identity is shaped less by ancestry than by proximity to ships. As a boy, he watches vessels arrive from distant places with damaged sails and exhausted crews. These ships carry more than goods. They carry stories compressed into fragments. Storms in the Tyrrhenian Sea, pirates near the Barbary coast, islands that appear and disappear depending on who is speaking. Even simple trade routes take on a sense of uncertainty when repeated often enough. The Mediterranean is not yet fully mapped in the modern sense. It is known, but not completely understood. And that gap between knowledge and mystery becomes the intellectual atmosphere Columbus grows into. It is easy to imagine him standing at the edge of the docks, observing workers unload barrels of oil, sacks of grain, bolts of cloth. Every object has travelled farther than most people in the city ever will. That realisation carries a quiet weight, the idea that life beyond Genoa is not just different, but vast, fragmented, and still waiting to be connected. Scholars still debate how early this sense of restlessness forms in him, but what is clear is that Genoa itself provides the foundation. The city is also politically tense. Competing families, shifting alliances, and external pressures from larger European powers create a constant undercurrent of instability. Genoa is wealthy but vulnerable, powerful but never secure. For someone growing up within its walls, certainty is not a given. This instability mirrors the sea itself, where calm surfaces can conceal sudden storms. In such an environment, ambition does not feel unusual, it feels necessary. As Columbus enters adolescence, he begins working in maritime environments. The details vary across accounts, but he likely serves in minor roles aboard merchant ships, learning how sails respond to wind, how currents shift near coastlines, and how navigation depends as much on experience and intuition as on instruments. There are no modern maps with precise coordinates guiding him, only portolan charts, rough calculations, and the accumulated memory of sailors who have travelled before him. Every voyage carries a margin of uncertainty that no one can fully eliminate. The Mediterranean trade network he encounters is already deeply interconnected, yet still limited by geography and political boundaries. Goods move efficiently between ports like Venice, Barcelona, Alexandria, and Constantinople. But the idea of crossing an entire ocean remains something else entirely. It belongs more to speculation than to practice. Even experienced sailors treat the open Atlantic with caution, not because it is unknown in theory, but because it is unpredictable in experience. It is within this tension between the known and unknown that Columbus's early worldview takes shape. He learns that the sea is both a pathway and a barrier, a surface that connects civilizations while also hiding vast distances between them. Ships return with valuable cargo, but also with gaps in their knowledge, missing stretches of coastline, uncertain reports of lands beyond familiar maps, contradictions that no single authority resolves. One lesser-known aspect of Genoa's maritime culture is how often sailors rely on oral transmission of information rather than written documentation. Stories of navigation are passed along like living tools, reshaped slightly with each retelling. This creates a fluid understanding of geography, where certainty is always provisional. For a young navigator in training, this environment teaches adaptability, but also leaves room for speculation to grow unchecked. Columbus absorbs all of this without yet forming a clear ambition. There is no documented moment in his youth where he declares a destiny. Instead, there is accumulation of skills, of observations, of contradictions between what maps claim and what sailors describe. The harbour is his classroom, but it is a classroom without boundaries, where every lesson suggests there is more to learn just beyond the horizon. As the years pass, the ships grow larger in his experience, and the distances they travel seem to stretch further in his imagination. Genoa remains constant behind him, its towers, its crowded alleys, its merchant exchanges, but the world beyond it begins to feel less like scattered destinations and more like a continuous space waiting to be crossed. What remains from this early period is not a single defining event, but a gradual shaping of perspective. A city built on trade teaches him that value lies in movement, a harbour built on departures teaches him that arrival is always temporary, and a sea that never stops shifting teaches him that maps, no matter how carefully drawn, are never the final version of reality. In that quiet accumulation of experience, long before voyages across oceans are even imaginable, the foundations of Columbus's later life are already forming, rooted in a harbour that never stops moving, in a world that is always slightly larger than its maps, and in a childhood shaped by the constant presence of the unknown just beyond the waterline. The Mediterranean does not teach navigation as a single skill, it teaches fragments of it, scattered across years of work, observation, and repetition. For Columbus, these fragments come slowly, not as formal education, but as lived experience aboard merchant vessels that cut through a tightly woven network of ports, islands, and shifting political borders. Each voyage adds another layer to his understanding of how fragile human movement across water can be, even in a sea that is considered known. By the time he reaches young adulthood, Columbus is no longer simply a dockside observer. He's part of the machinery of trade itself. Ships require constant labour repairing sails, managing cargo, reading wind changes, and in this environment, there is little separation between survival and skill. A mistake at sea is not theoretical. It becomes wind lost, time wasted, or worse, a vessel pushed off course into unfamiliar waters where charts offer diminishing guidance. The Mediterranean world he moves through is densely connected but politically fragmented. Genoa, Venice, Aragon, and other powers compete for trade dominance. While the remnants of older empires still shape coastal routes and alliances, the sea becomes a contested space, not an open one. Navigation is therefore not just technical but strategic. Knowing where to sail is also knowing where conflict might emerge, where taxes are collected, where safe harbours exist, and where they suddenly do not. Columbus's early seafaring years likely include voyages along the western Mediterranean and possibly as far as the Aegean or North African coast. The exact record is incomplete, and historians still debate the full extent of his early travels. What remains consistent, however, is the exposure to diverse maritime systems. He learns how different ports interpret weather signs differently, how pilots rely on local knowledge that does not always translate across regions, and how even experienced sailors disagree on distances that modern maps would later standardize. One of the most important skills he develops is not navigation itself, but pattern recognition. He observes how currents behave near coastlines, how cloud formations hint at wind shifts, and how star positions can be used for rough orientation at night. These are not abstract sciences in his world. They are practical tools learned through repetition and risk, yet even these tools have limits. In the Mediterranean, land is rarely out of reach for long. The idea of being surrounded entirely by open ocean is still distant, almost theoretical. Ships of this era are also fragile in ways that modern readers often underestimate. Wooden hulls expand and contract with moisture, sails degrade under constant sun exposure, and navigation instruments are crude by later standards. The compass, though available, is still developing in reliability. Dead reckoning estimating position based on speed and direction remains essential, but it accumulates errors quickly over distance. Each voyage therefore carries a gradual drift away from certainty. Corrected only when land reappears? This dependence on approximation shapes Columbus's thinking more than any formal instruction could. He learns to accept error as part of movement. A ship rarely knows its exact position. It only knows its relationship to previous positions and expected outcomes. Over time, this mindset becomes crucial to understanding how he later interprets larger geographical questions. There is also a lesser-known aspect of Mediterranean navigation culture during this period, the reliance on composite knowledge systems. Sailors often combine empirical observation with inherited tradition and occasional classical references from ancient texts. Works attributed to Ptolemy or other classical geographers are not always treated as authoritative, but they are respected as starting points. This blend of observation and inherited theory creates a flexible but sometimes contradictory worldview, where maps can be both helpful and misleading at the same time. For Columbus, this intellectual environment is formative. He's not a university-trained cosmographer, yet he is surrounded by people who constantly interpret the world in semi-structured ways. Distances are estimated, not measured precisely. Coastlines are described through memory rather than survey. Even experienced pilots disagree about fundamental geographic relationships. In such a world, certainty is always provisional, and imagination fills the gaps between verified knowledge. As his experience grows, Columbus becomes increasingly aware of something subtle but important. The known world feels larger in theory than in practice, yet still bounded in ways that seem arbitrary. Ships can travel far, but always within a circuit that eventually returns them to familiar shores. Trade routes expand, but they do not break free from the edges of mapped geography. This creates a quiet tension between what is travelled and what is still assumed to exist beyond travel. Some historical interpretations suggest that during these years, Columbus may have been exposed to early discussions about alternative routes to Asia, including westward possibilities, though these ideas were not mainstream. Maritime communities often circulated speculative theories alongside practical knowledge. What is certain is that by this stage, he has absorbed enough navigation experience to understand both the power and limitations of conventional routes. Another important influence is the increasing circulation of geographical texts in late medieval Europe. While Columbus was not necessarily a scholar of these works in a formal sense, the broader intellectual climate included debates about the size of the Earth, the distribution of land masses, and the feasibility of long-distance sea travel. These debates were not resolved, and different authorities proposed conflicting measurements. This inconsistency left room for interpretation, especially for someone with practical maritime experience. What distinguishes Columbus from many of his contemporaries is not that he possessed radically new knowledge, but that he began to connect existing uncertainties into a unified possibility. Where others saw gaps in information, he began to see potential pathways. Where maps ended, he began to imagine continuation. By the time he reaches maturity as a sailor, Columbus is no longer shaped solely by Genoa or by individual voyages. He is shaped by a layered understanding of a world that is simultaneously mapped and unmapped, known and uncertain, structured and incomplete. The Mediterranean has taught him precision within limits, but also the persistence of unknown space beyond those limits. And it is within that tension between the mapped and the unmapped that the idea of something larger than the Mediterranean begins to take form, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of possibility shaped by years at sea. The late medieval world does not feel like a civilization preparing for global expansion. It feels, instead, like a series of tightly bound regions, each convinced of its own centrality, each constrained by geography, politics, and inherited assumptions about the edges of the known world. Yet beneath this apparent stability, pressure is building, trade routes are stretching, populations are growing unevenly, and the demand for luxury goods from the East is becoming more than a matter of comfort, it is becoming a matter of power. Spices, in particular, occupy a strange place in European life. They are not merely flavouring agents but symbols of status, medicine, and economic leverage. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg travel across long and costly routes controlled by intermediaries in the Islamic world and Venetian trade networks. Each transfer adds value, each middleman increases cost, and by the time these goods reach Western Europe, their price reflects not only rarity, but geopolitical distance. This economic structure quietly shapes the ambitions of entire kingdoms. Columbus enters this world as a working navigator, but he is increasingly aware that navigation is tied to something larger than maritime skill. It is tied to access. Whoever controls routes controls wealth, and whoever finds a shorter route may reshape the balance of power itself. This is not yet his personal obsession, but it is the atmosphere in which his thinking begins to evolve. At the same time, Europe is undergoing a slow transformation in geographical imagination. The recovery of classical texts, especially those from ancient Greek and Roman authors, introduces new, but often conflicting ideas about the size and structure of the Earth. Ptolemy's calculations, for example, offer a systematic model of the world, but they are based on incomplete data and interpretations that later prove inaccurate. Still, in Columbus's time, these works are treated with respect, even when they contradict practical observations. One of the most important intellectual tensions of the period is the disagreement over the Earth's circumference. Some scholars argue for a larger globe, consistent with cautious empirical reasoning. Others, relying on alternative interpretations of ancient measurements, suggest a smaller Earth. This difference is not trivial. It determines whether a westward voyage from Europe to Asia is impossible, improbable, or theoretically achievable. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single authority resolves the debate. Columbus becomes increasingly drawn into this unresolved space between competing models. He is not a theoretical geographer by training, but he has spent years observing the inconsistencies between charts, travel times, and sailor testimonies. When experienced pilots disagree about distances, and when maps fail to match lived experience, he begins to suspect that the accepted models of the world may not be fully correct. There is a subtle but important detail often overlooked in simplified retellings of this period. Maritime knowledge and scholarly geography rarely align perfectly. Sailors rely on practical repetition, while scholars rely on inherited texts. The two systems overlap but do not fully integrate. Columbus stands at the intersection of these two ways of knowing, and that position gives him both insight and vulnerability. He sees patterns that academics may dismiss, but he also lacks formal validation for his interpretations. During this time, Portugal emerges as a major maritime power pushing southward along the African coast. Portuguese expeditions gradually open new routes around Cape Bojador and beyond, challenging older assumptions about the limits of navigation. These voyages demonstrate that previously unreachable regions are, in fact, accessible with persistence and improved technique. For Columbus, this expansion of possibility is significant. It suggests that boundaries are not fixed, only untested. Still, the idea of crossing an entire ocean remains controversial. The Atlantic is not unknown, but it is feared for its scale and unpredictability. Medieval maps often depict it as a vast and uncertain boundary space, filled with speculative islands and ambiguous margins. Sailors understand coastal waters well, but open ocean navigation introduces psychological and logistical challenges that Mediterranean experience does not fully prepare them for. It is in this intellectual and maritime environment that Columbus begins to form a controversial interpretation of existing geographical knowledge. He studies available maps, reads translations of geographical works, and listens to accounts from other navigators. Gradually, he arrives at a belief that Asia lies much closer to Europe when travelling westward than commonly assumed. This conclusion is not derived from a single source, but from a synthesis of selective readings, navigational intuition, and a willingness to challenge prevailing estimates. Importantly, this interpretation depends on a miscalculation of Earth's size. Columbus accepts, or is influenced by, smaller estimates of the planet's circumference than most contemporary scholars considered accurate. Combined with exaggerated assumptions about the eastward extension of Asia, this creates a theoretical possibility that the ocean between Europe and Asia might be traversable within a reasonable voyage. Most experts of the time disagree with this conclusion, but disagreement in this era does not necessarily lead to resolution. What makes Columbus's position unusual is not just the idea itself, but his persistence in treating it as actionable. Many thinkers speculated about geography. Few attempted to turn speculation into a concrete plan for navigation. Columbus begins to move from theory toward application, even though he lacks institutional support or consensus validation. There are also cultural and religious dimensions shaping his worldview. Late medieval Europe often interprets exploration through a broader framework of providence, destiny, and expansion of Christendom. While Columbus's personal motivations are complex and debated, it is clear that his ideas are not purely scientific or economic. They exist within a worldview where discovery and belief are often intertwined, and where distant lands are not only geographic targets, but potential extensions of familiar cultural systems. By the time he begins seeking sponsorship, Columbus is carrying more than a navigational theory. He carries a reinterpretation of global structure, one that challenges conventional distance, reorders economic expectations, and reframes the ocean as a bridge rather than a barrier. Whether correct or not, this idea has enough internal coherence to be persuasive to some and provocative to others. And it is this combination maritime experience, selective interpretation of geography, and the growing economic pressure of European trade that sets the stage for his transition from sailor to petitioner, from navigator of known waters to claimant of unknown possibilities. The idea does not arrive in Columbus's mind as a sudden revelation, but rather as a slow tightening of conviction. Years of seafaring experience, combined with fragmented geographical knowledge circulating through Europe, begin to coalesce into a single, unstable proposition that the Western Ocean is not an ending, but a shortcut. In a world where trade routes stretch across continents and through multiple intermediaries, the promise of a direct path is not just appealing, it is transformative. At the centre of this belief is a calculation problem that defines everything that follows. Columbus accepts certain geographical estimates that significantly reduce the perceived circumference of the Earth, while also assuming that Asia extends farther east than most scholars believed. These two errors, when combined, produce a narrow but critical gap in reasoning. Within that gap, a westward voyage appears possible within the limits of contemporary ship endurance. Most learned geographers reject this conclusion, but their rejection does not erase the uncertainty embedded in the data itself. What makes this moment historically significant is not simply that Columbus is wrong in modern terms, but that the available knowledge of the time does not fully close the question. Competing measurements, incomplete exploration, and inherited classical authorities leave enough ambiguity for alternative interpretations to exist. The evidence remains incomplete, and in that incompleteness, imagination finds space to operate. Columbus begins to refine his argument into something that can be presented to patrons. He is not merely suggesting exploration, he is proposing a reconfiguration of global access. In practical terms, this means bypassing established trade networks controlled by Venice and intermediaries in the Eastern Mediterranean. If successful, such a route would have profound economic consequences. It would alter the flow of spices, precious metals, and goods that define European wealth. However, turning theory into sponsorship proves difficult. Maritime knowledge alone is not sufficient to convince royal courts, where decisions are shaped by politics, competing advisors, and existing strategic priorities. Columbus must therefore translate his idea into the language of power. He frames his proposal not as speculation, but as opportunity, a direct route to Asia that could elevate any kingdom willing to support it. The response he receives is largely sceptical. Scholars and advisors question his assumptions about distance. Experienced navigators raise concerns about the viability of long ocean crossings without known resupply points. Even if land exists beyond the horizon, there is no guarantee it can support a return journey. The Atlantic is not simply empty space, it is an unknown system of currents, weather patterns, and risks that Mediterranean experience does not fully prepare one to interpret. Despite this skepticism, Columbus persists. His persistence is not merely stubbornness, it is shaped by a belief that opposition stems from conventional thinking rather than superior knowledge. This creates a tension between him and the institutions he approaches. To them, he appears overconfident. To himself, he appears as someone reading patterns others have not yet connected. During this period, Europe itself is undergoing political consolidation. Emerging centralized monarchies are beginning to replace fragmented feudal systems, creating new conditions for large-scale investment in exploration. Portugal has already demonstrated the value of maritime expansion along Africa's coastline, and competition between Iberian powers is intensifying. Yet even in this competitive environment, Columbus's proposal is considered extreme. It does not fit comfortably within known models of risk and reward. An often overlooked aspect of this phase is the role of advisors and intermediaries who shape how proposals are filtered before reaching monarchs. Columbus does not simply present his idea to a single decision-maker. He navigates a layered system of court officials, scholars, and ecclesiastical figures, each of whom evaluates his claims through different criteria: scientific plausibility, financial risk, religious implications, and political utility. At each stage, his proposal is questioned, delayed or reframed. Still, he continues to refine his presentation. He emphasizes precedent, referencing earlier geographical speculation and classical ideas about the unity of the world's oceans. He also highlights potential strategic advantages, suggesting that any new route could give Spain access to wealth and influence comparable to existing maritime powers. In doing so, he shifts his argument from pure geography to geopolitical advantage. Yet one critical obstacle remains trust. Columbus is not a widely recognized academic authority, nor a proven explorer of unknown oceans. He is a mariner with experience, but not a scholar with institutional backing. In an era where authority matters as much as evidence, this lack of status becomes a significant barrier. At the same time, uncertainty about global geography continues to linger even among experts. No European power has yet demonstrated a westward route to Asia. The limits of the Atlantic remain untested. This absence of proof cuts both ways. It undermines Columbus's claim, but it also leaves open the theoretical possibility that such a route exists. As years pass, Columbus moves between courts, patrons, and advisors, refining his proposal while adapting to political realities. Rejection does not end his pursuit, it reshapes it. Each refusal forces him to adjust language, simplify claims, or emphasize different aspects of his theory. The idea itself remains stable, but its presentation becomes increasingly strategic. Behind all of this lies a broader historical tension. Europe is on the edge of expanding its geographical boundaries, but it has not yet resolved how far those boundaries extend. Knowledge is accumulating, but not yet unified. Exploration is increasing, but still limited. Columbus's proposal sits directly inside this unresolved space between what is known and what is possible. And it is within this unstable environment where geography, politics, and ambition intersect without clear resolution that the final opportunity eventually emerges, not because his theory is universally accepted, but because the political moment finally allows it to be tested. The court of Spain does not move quickly, nor does it move on logic alone. It moves through layers of influence, personal relationships, shifting priorities, and the slow alignment of political opportunity. For Columbus, the years spent approaching royal patronage are not a single negotiation, but a prolonged passage through uncertainty, where the same idea is repeatedly examined, dismissed, revived, and reconsidered under different circumstances. By the time he reaches the Spanish court in earnest, the Iberian Peninsula is undergoing a decisive transformation. The Reconquista is nearing its final phase, and the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, are consolidating power over a previously fragmented political landscape. Military campaigns against the last Moorish strongholds demand resources, attention, and strategic focus. In this environment, any proposal for overseas exploration must compete with immediate territorial concerns. Columbus presents himself not simply as a navigator, but as someone offering strategic expansion beyond Europe. His argument is consistent: a westward route to Asia could bypass established trade networks, bring direct access to valuable goods, and elevate Spain into a position of maritime dominance. The idea is ambitious, but ambition alone is not enough to overcome skepticism. Advisors question the accuracy of his distance calculations, and scholars warn that the ocean he proposes to cross is far larger than he assumes. What makes the situation complex is that Spain is not entirely closed to exploration. Portugal's success along the African coast has already demonstrated that maritime expansion can yield significant rewards. Yet Portugal's model is incremental, hugging coastlines, expanding gradually, and maintaining supply lines. Columbus's proposal is fundamentally different. It is not coastal expansion, but direct transoceanic traversal. That difference is not merely technical, it is psychological. It requires accepting prolonged uncertainty with no guaranteed intermediate landfall. At court, Columbus encounters a system where knowledge is distributed across competing authorities. Theologians, astronomers, navigators, and political advisors each evaluate his proposal from different angles. Some find his logic intriguing but unproven. Others dismiss it as impractical or dangerously speculative. A few see potential, but not enough to justify immediate investment. The result is not a single rejection, but a long suspension of decision. During this period, Columbus lives in a state of persistent negotiation. He revises his arguments repeatedly, sometimes emphasizing economic benefits, other times appealing to religious or imperial ideals. He suggests that new lands could expand Christendom, a framing that resonates with certain factions within the court, yet even this is not sufficient to secure immediate approval. The monarchy is cautious, balancing ambition with risk. One lesser-known aspect of this phase is the role of financial constraints. Spain, despite its growing power, is still recovering from military expenditures associated with unification and ongoing conflicts. Funding a transoceanic expedition is not a minor decision. It requires allocating ships, supplies, and personnel for a voyage with no guaranteed return. In practical terms, the risk is extreme. Columbus's persistence becomes both his strength and his burden. He is neither easily dismissed nor easily accepted. His proposal exists in a liminal space too plausible to ignore completely, too uncertain to endorse outright. This creates a prolonged limbo in which he continues to wait, advocate, and adapt. At one point, he considers abandoning Spain entirely, seeking support elsewhere. Historical accounts suggest he may have approached Portugal again after earlier rejection there, but the timing proves unfavourable. Portuguese focus has shifted toward African routes, and internal advisers are not convinced by his revised estimates. Once again, he is denied, not because his idea is disproven, but because it does not align with current strategic priorities. Back in Spain, his situation reaches a turning point not through new evidence, but through changing political context. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492 alters the strategic landscape. With the conquest of Granada, resources and attention are freed from decades of internal warfare. This shift creates space for new forms of expansion. Spain, newly unified and politically stabilised, is more open to external ventures than before. Even then, approval is not immediate. Negotiations intensify over terms titles, privileges, governance rights over potential discoveries, and distribution of profits. Columbus is not merely asking to sail, he is negotiating the structure of authority over lands that have not yet been reached. These negotiations reflect the broader uncertainty of the endeavour itself. Everything depends on what might be found. Eventually, a fragile agreement is reached. The monarchy agrees to sponsor a small expedition, but under strict conditions, Columbus is granted titles and a share of potential gains. But the resources provided are modest compared to the scale of his claims. The ships are not large fleets of conquest, but limited vessels, carefully assembled for a journey into uncertainty rather than a guaranteed route. What is important here is not just the approval, but the nature of it. Spain does not fully commit to Columbus's theory. Instead, it invests in the possibility that he might be correct. This distinction is crucial. The expedition is not an endorsement of his calculations. It is a controlled risk based on incomplete knowledge. As preparations begin, Columbus steps out of the abstract world of argument and into the physical reality of implementation. Ships must be selected, crews assembled, supplies calculated, and routes planned based on uncertain geography. The idea that once existed only in calculations and court discussions now begins to take material form, and as the vessels prepare to leave port, carrying with them a mixture of hope, skepticism, and political calculation, the boundary between theory and reality begins to narrow until the ocean itself becomes the final test of everything that has been argued, doubted, and barely accepted. The harbour of Palos de la Frontera does not look like the beginning of a world-changing voyage. It looks, instead, like a place used to small departures fishing boats slipping out before dawn, merchant vessels returning with modest cargo, sailors arguing over weather that might change without warning. Yet in August of 1492, this ordinary port becomes the threshold of an experiment that carries more uncertainty than anyone on the docks fully understands. 3 ships are prepared for the voyage. The Santa Maria, the largest, serves as Columbus's flagship, while the Nina and the Pinta provide faster, smaller support. None of them are built for deep ocean exploration in the modern sense. They are adapted coastal and trade vessels, designed for familiar waters where land is never too far away. This mismatch between design and mission is one of the quiet contradictions of the expedition, an ambitious goal carried by limited tools. Columbus steps into this moment not as a celebrated conqueror, but as a navigator with conditional authority. His command is real, but fragile, dependent on royal backing, and constrained by the practical limits of crew cooperation. The men who sail with him are not volunteers for ideological exploration, they are sailors, many of them there because of obligation, economic necessity, or legal arrangements made through local authorities. Before departure, there is no sense of historical inevitability. There is only preparation. Supplies are loaded carefully salted meat, hardtack, water barrels, and trade goods intended for potential encounters. Navigation tools are checked and rechecked, though their precision is limited. The crew carries maps that are incomplete by modern standards, reflecting a world still partially uncharted beyond its known coasts. One often overlooked detail of this moment is the psychological tension among the sailors. Even experienced mariners are aware that no reliable account exists of a successful westward crossing of the Atlantic from Europe to Asia. The ocean ahead is not simply unknown, it is unverified as a route to anything at all. Stories of distant islands and speculative geography circulate among sailors, but they do not constitute evidence. As the ships leave port, the coastline of Spain slowly recedes. For a time, land remains visible, a reassuring presence on the horizon, but gradually it diminishes until only sea remains. At this point, the psychological transition begins. The ocean is no longer a familiar corridor between coasts. It becomes an enclosed space without visible boundaries, a continuous surface with no clear indication of distance or direction. Navigation during this phase relies heavily on dead reckoning and celestial observation. The crew tracks direction using the compass and estimates speed through rudimentary measurement techniques. However, every calculation accumulates small errors. Over time, these errors build into uncertainty about their true position. In a sea without landmarks, uncertainty becomes a constant companion. As days pass, the psychological strain intensifies. The ocean does not change in a way that confirms progress. Water, wind, and horizon remain largely uniform. For sailors accustomed to coastal navigation, this lack of variation is deeply unsettling. The absence of familiar reference points creates doubt not just about location, but about the logic of the journey itself. Columbus maintains discipline among the crew, but tensions begin to surface. Reports of unusual signs, floating vegetation, distant birds, Shifts in wind patterns are interpreted in different ways. To some, they suggest proximity to land. To others, they are meaningless variations in oceanic conditions. The same observations produce conflicting conclusions, revealing how little certainty exists in interpreting the open sea. A lesser-known aspect of this voyage is how carefully Columbus manages information. He records distances in ways that reduce perceived travel time, partly to maintain morale, whether intentional or interpretive. This discrepancy between perceived and actual progress becomes a subtle but important factor in sustaining the expedition's continuation. The crew's understanding of their journey is shaped not only by the sea, but by how that sea is described to them. As the voyage continues, doubt grows more visible. Some crew members begin to fear that they are sailing beyond return. The ocean, in their perception, may be larger than expected, with no guarantee of land ahead or behind. This fear is not irrational within their framework of knowledge. It arises from the absence of confirmation, not from evidence of failure. Columbus, however, remains committed to his calculations. He interprets signs of change as evidence that land is near, maintaining confidence even as uncertainty increases around him. This divergence between leadership conviction and crew anxiety becomes one of the defining psychological dynamics of the journey. What emerges during these weeks is not just a physical crossing, but a collapse of familiar geography. The ocean ceases to function as a known space and becomes a field of pure uncertainty, where interpretation replaces certainty and belief competes with observation, and in that expanding silence of open water, where every direction looks the same and every calculation carries doubt, the expedition moves closer to a moment that will either confirm The ocean changes nothing on the surface, yet everything changes beneath it. Days at sea begin to blur into one another, not because time stops, but because time loses its markers. There are no coastlines sliding past, no familiar harbours appearing at predictable intervals, only an endless sequence of waves that erase themselves as quickly as they form. For the crew of Columbus's expedition, this is where the voyage stops feeling like travel and starts feeling like suspension. The psychological weight of open water is difficult to overstate. On land, distance is measured by obstacles, mountains, rivers, settlements. At sea, distance is invisible. A ship may move steadily forward for days without producing any visible change in the world around it. This creates a disorienting gap between effort and perception, where progress can only be trusted through calculation rather than experience. Columbus relies heavily on this calculated sense of progress. Each day, he records estimated distances, wind conditions, and course adjustments. These records form a narrative of movement that may not always align perfectly with the crew's intuitive sense of how far they have travelled. In an environment where no external reference points exist, numbers become the only anchor against uncertainty. Meanwhile, the crew begins to interpret the same environment in increasingly symbolic ways. Floating vegetation is seen as a possible sign of nearby land. Flocks of birds crossing the sky become indicators of direction. Even subtle shifts in water colour or temperature are given meaning. These interpretations are not irrational. They are attempts to restore structure to a world that offers none. The ocean, in this sense, becomes a surface onto which human expectation is constantly projected. One lesser-known aspect of this phase of the voyage is the emergence of informal signals of return among sailors. Certain natural signs are historically associated with proximity to land. But in the open Atlantic, their reliability is uncertain. What matters is not their accuracy, but their psychological function. They provide moments of hope that interrupt the monotony of uncertainty. As the voyage extends further, tension between confidence and doubt grows sharper. Some members of the crew begin to fear that the expedition has passed beyond any reasonable expectation of return. This fear is not simply emotional. It is grounded in their experience of Mediterranean navigation, where distances are constrained and reversal is always possible. Here, however, the absence of land challenges that assumption. Columbus faces a critical leadership problem. Maintaining order requires more than authority. It requires sustaining belief in the logic of the journey. If the crew loses confidence entirely, the expedition risks collapse. Yet too much reassurance risks deepening mistrust if expectations are not met. He navigates this tension carefully, emphasizing signs of progress while maintaining discipline over the pace of travel. At the same time, environmental conditions begin to shift subtly. The sea remains vast and uniform, but variations in currents, wind patterns, and floating debris become slightly more frequent. These changes are ambiguous. They could indicate proximity to land, or they could simply reflect normal Atlantic variability. The uncertainty remains unresolved, but attention intensifies around these small deviations. It is within this atmosphere of heightened sensitivity that reports of unusual sightings begin to spread through the crew. Distant lights, drifting branches, and changes in bird behaviour are all noted and interpreted. Each observation becomes a potential confirmation that the voyage is nearing its destination. Yet none of these signs are definitive. They exist in a space between observation and interpretation, where meaning is shaped as much by desire as by evidence. A critical and often understated element of this phase is how expectation reshapes perception. After weeks at sea, the crew is no longer neutral observers of the environment. They are participants in a narrative that demands resolution. The possibility of land is no longer an abstract idea. It becomes a psychological necessity. This does not mean they are delusional, but rather that their interpretation of ambiguous data becomes increasingly influenced by the need for closure. Columbus himself occupies a more complex position. His confidence in reaching land is not purely emotional, It is grounded in his calculations and theoretical framework. However, even his interpretation of signs becomes increasingly selective. Each indication of change is weighed carefully, but not always neutrally. The boundary between evidence and expectation becomes difficult to maintain in an environment where evidence is sparse. Then, as tension reaches its peak, the environment begins to shift in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. Birds appear in greater numbers, some of them clearly not suited for long-distance flight over open ocean. The water carries more debris, some of it organic in origin. These are not dramatic transformations, but they are cumulative. Together, they suggest a transition zone between deep ocean and coastal proximity. For the crew, this is both relief and destabilization. Relief, because it suggests the possibility of land nearby. Destabilization, because it confirms how little they truly know about their position. If land is near, it means they have been closer to uncertainty than they realized. If it is not, then interpretation itself becomes unreliable. Columbus responds by increasing vigilance. Navigation becomes more precise, observation more frequent. The expedition enters a state of heightened readiness, where every change in wind or sea surface is treated as potentially significant. The ocean, once perceived as uniform, now becomes textured with meaning, as if it is gradually revealing hidden structure beneath its surface. And it is within this fragile balance of interpretation and uncertainty, where hope and doubt occupy the same observations, that the expedition moves toward the threshold of landfall, still without certainty, but no longer in the same ocean they entered weeks before. The first sighting is not land, but the possibility of land. It arrives in fragments, through signals too small to confirm and too persistent to ignore. A cluster of birds flying at a distance that suggests destination, a change in the rhythm of waves, as if the ocean is being shaped by something beneath the horizon, bits of vegetation drifting in patterns that feel less random than before. None of these signs are definitive on their own. Yet together they begin to reshape the crew's understanding of where they are. After weeks of uniform water and sky, the Atlantic begins to feel less like emptiness and more like transition. The crew does not yet know what lies ahead, but the psychological shift is unmistakable. Exhaustion does not disappear, but it is now accompanied by anticipation. The idea of land stops being abstract and starts becoming procedural, something expected within a calculable distance. Columbus treats these signs as confirmation of his expectations. For him, they align with the logic of his calculations and reinforce his belief that Asia lies within reachable distance westward. Yet even for him, certainty is not absolute. The ocean has not yet offered a single, undeniable proof of proximity, no coastline, no anchored reference point, nothing that fully resolves ambiguity. What exists instead is accumulation hints building toward conclusion without completing it. Then comes the night of October 11th, 1492. It begins, as many moments at sea do, without dramatic distinction. The ocean remains dark, steady, and indistinguishable from previous nights. The crew maintains routine watch rotations. There is no immediate indication that the long uncertainty of the voyage is about to collapse into recognition. Yet somewhere in that darkness, movement is detected ahead, something different from the rhythm of the waves. The first observer is not Columbus. It is a sailor on lookout duty aboard one of the smaller ships, who notices what appears to be a faint irregularity in the distance. It is not yet land in a confirmed sense. It is a disruption in expectation, a break in the continuity of darkness. In maritime conditions, such breaks are dangerous to ignore and equally dangerous to misinterpret. As the signal is passed along, tension spreads through the fleet, lanterns are raised, eyes strain into the night. The ocean, which has been an unchanging field for so long, suddenly becomes a surface of potential revelation. Yet confirmation does not arrive immediately. Instead, there is delay and interval in which interpretation struggles against uncertainty. Columbus himself observes the situation with caution. Experience has taught him that early signs can be misleading, especially at sea where perception is vulnerable to distortion. He does not immediately declare landfall. Instead, he waits, allowing additional evidence to accumulate. This hesitation becomes crucial, because it preserves the distinction between hope and confirmation. Then, as the night progresses, the evidence becomes harder to dismiss. Shapes begin to emerge where there was previously only darkness. The outline of something solid interrupts the horizon line. The crew, now fully alert, begins to interpret these shapes collectively, reinforcing each other's perceptions. What was once ambiguous becomes increasingly structured. By the time dawn approaches, transformation is no longer uncertain. The ocean gives way to land. The island that appears is not the Asian continent Columbus had envisioned, but part of the Caribbean archipelago. At the moment of arrival, however, this distinction does not yet exist in the minds of the crew. What matters is not classification, but transition from open ocean to solid ground, from uncertainty to contact. The psychological impact is immediate. After weeks of uniform motion and endless water, the presence of land creates a rupture in perception. Distance becomes real again. Orientation returns. The world regains edges. For sailors who have begun to question whether the voyage might continue indefinitely, this moment restores the fundamental structure of travel departure, movement, arrival. Columbus steps onto land believing, based on his calculations and expectations, that he has reached islands near Asia. This interpretation is not unusual within his intellectual framework. The possibility of unknown intermediary lands was already part of geographical speculation in Europe. What he does not yet realise is that the entire structure of his assumption about global distance will be fundamentally challenged by what lies ahead. The island itself is inhabited. The people Columbus encounters belong to the Taino societies, part of a complex network of indigenous cultures spread across the Caribbean. Their presence immediately complicates the narrative of discovery. This is not empty land awaiting arrival. It is a populated world with its own history, language, and social structure. The evidence of human life is not marginal, it is central to the landscape. Initial interactions are shaped by mutual incomprehension. Communication does not rely on shared language or conceptual frameworks. Instead, it is mediated through gestures, observation, and rapid interpretation of unfamiliar behaviour. Both sides attempt to categorise the other within their own existing frameworks of understanding. This process inevitably produces distortion. Columbus interprets the inhabitants through the lens of his expectations, seeing potential subjects of conversion and trade within a broader Asian framework. The Taino, encountering unfamiliar ships and foreign arrivals, respond within their own cultural context, which is not preserved in full detail by historical records, but is understood through archaeological and anthropological reconstruction. What is clear is that the encounter is not symmetrical in power or perception. One side arrives with technological advantages in navigation and maritime mobility. The other possesses deep knowledge of the local environment and established social systems. Yet neither fully comprehends the other's world in its entirety. As the initial contact stabilizes, attention shifts from discovery to interaction. Resources are assessed, relationships are tentatively formed, and the practical realities of sustaining a presence on the island begin to emerge. The expedition has crossed the ocean, but it has not yet resolved what that crossing means. And in this unresolved space between expectation and reality, between imagined Asia and encountered Caribbean world, the voyage enters its next phase, where interpretation will prove as consequential as discovery itself. The first days on land carry a strange sense of reversal. After weeks of motion without ground, everything now feels excessively solid, as if the world has regained weight it had temporarily lost at sea. The ships rest in shallow waters, anchored near unfamiliar shores where the rhythm of waves is no longer infinite but interrupted by coastline, reef, and vegetation. For the crew, even simple acts walking, gathering water, observing the horizon feel newly grounded in a way that is both reassuring and disorienting. Columbus and his men are not the first humans on this island, but they arrive as if encountering a world newly introduced into European awareness. The Taino population inhabits a complex landscape of settlements, cultivated fields, fishing zones, and ritual spaces. This is not an untouched environment. It is a managed and meaningful world, shaped by generations of knowledge about soil, weather, and seasonal cycles. Yet for the newcomers, this structure is initially invisible beneath surface impressions. One of the earliest misunderstandings arises from perception itself. Columbus interprets the islands through a framework shaped by his expectation of Asia. This does not mean he fails to observe what is in front of him, but rather that he filters observation through a pre-existing model. In his view, these lands are likely outlying regions of the broader Asian sphere, possibly islands near Japan or the East Indies. This assumption is not unique to him. It reflects the geographical uncertainty of the period, where incomplete maps allow multiple interpretations of the same space. The Taino, in turn, encounter the expedition without any conceptual preparation for transoceanic arrival. The ships themselves are unprecedented in their experience large, unfamiliar structures carrying people, tools, and intentions that cannot be easily categorized. Early interactions rely on gesture, exchange of objects, and observation of behavior. Gold becomes a focal point quickly, not because it dominates local economies in the same way as in Europe, but because it is immediately recognized as a material of value by the newcomers. A lesser-known aspect of these first encounters is the speed at which symbolic meaning is assigned to objects and behaviors. Items that hold ceremonial or ornamental significance within Taino culture are rapidly reinterpreted through European economic frameworks. This process of translation is not neutral. It transforms meaning at the moment of exchange. What is understood as cultural expression in one system becomes resource extraction in another. Columbus begins documenting his impressions, noting the appearance, hospitality, and material possessions of the island inhabitants. His descriptions emphasize perceived simplicity and abundance, though these interpretations are shaped by a limited understanding of local social organization. The absence of familiar European structures leads him to characterize the environment in ways that reflect expectation rather than full comprehension. At the same time, the practical challenges of sustaining the expedition become increasingly apparent. The ships require maintenance, supplies must be managed carefully, and the crew must remain disciplined in an unfamiliar environment. The island provides resources, but not necessarily in forms immediately compatible with European maritime needs. This creates a dependence on local knowledge, even as that knowledge is not fully recognized as such. Interactions between the two groups are marked by uneven exchange. Small objects brought from Europe beads, metal trinkets, cloth are exchanged for local goods, including food and gold. These exchanges are interpreted differently by each side. For the Europeans, they represent trade and acquisition. For the Taino, they may initially be perceived as acts of reciprocity or curiosity. The imbalance in perceived value is not immediately understood by all participants. Meanwhile, Columbus continues to operate within his geographical framework. He believes he is exploring islands adjacent to Asia, and this belief shapes his interpretation of every encounter. Reports of larger lands beyond the immediate islands reinforce his expectation that he is near the outskirts of a much larger continental system. The evidence does not fully contradict his model, but it also does not confirm it in any definitive way. As days pass, the expedition begins to shift from discovery to establishment. Temporary structures are considered, routes between islands are observed, and attention turns toward identifying sources of wealth and strategic value. This transition marks a subtle but important change. The voyage is no longer purely exploratory. It is becoming observational occupation. Yet beneath these developments, a deeper tension is emerging. The world Columbus believes he has reached does not fully align with the world that exists in reality. The discrepancy is not immediately visible, but it is embedded in every interpretation of geography, every exchange of goods, every assumption about scale and distance. The Caribbean islands are not margins of Asia. They are part of a separate continental system that has not yet been integrated into European geographical understanding. This fact will not become clear immediately. Instead, it will emerge gradually through accumulation of contradictory evidence gathered over subsequent voyages. For now, however, the expedition remains anchored in its original assumption. The land is real, the inhabitants are real, and the possibility of wealth is real, but the meaning of where they are remains suspended between certainty and misunderstanding. And in that suspended understanding, where observation and interpretation no longer fully align, the consequences of discovery begin to take shape in ways none of the participants can yet fully recognize. The first settlement does not begin with grandeur, but with necessity. Wood is cut, shelters are raised, and a temporary order is imposed on unfamiliar terrain. The ocean is no longer the dominant presence. Instead, land introduces new challenges: humidity, unfamiliar insects, unstable supply chains, and the difficulty of sustaining European life in a climate and ecosystem that was never part of their preparation. The expedition, once defined by movement, now begins to define itself by endurance. Columbus authorizes the construction of a small fortified settlement, later known as La Navidad, using the remains of the Santa Maria after it runs aground and is dismantled for materials. This transformation is symbolic in a quiet way. One of the expedition's primary ships, once a vessel of possibility, becomes the structural foundation of its first foothold. What carried them across the ocean is now repurposed into permanence on land. At this stage, the relationship between the expedition and the Taino communities becomes more complex. Initial exchanges give way to more structured interactions, shaped increasingly by European expectations of resource acquisition and local cooperation. The imbalance in technological capability, especially in maritime mobility and metal tools, begins to shape the dynamics of contact more clearly. Yet local knowledge of the environment remains essential for survival, particularly in understanding food sources, seasonal patterns, and geography. A lesser-known detail of this early settlement period is the degree of improvisation involved in maintaining discipline among the crew. There are no established colonial systems yet, no administrative infrastructure designed for long-term occupation. Authority rests heavily on Columbus's personal command, which must be enforced in a context far removed from the institutional support structures of Spain. This creates a fragile hierarchy, dependent on both obedience and necessity. Meanwhile, Columbus continues to send reports back through returning ships, describing the lands encountered and the perceived proximity to Asia. His interpretations remain consistent with his original framework. The islands are treated as peripheral regions of a larger Asian geography. This belief is not simply stubbornness. It is reinforced by selective confirmation of geographical expectations and the absence of definitive contradictory evidence within his conceptual model. However, small inconsistencies begin to accumulate. The scale of the islands, the nature of local societies, and the absence of expected Asian markers such as major cities or familiar trade networks introduce subtle tensions in interpretation. These discrepancies do not immediately overturn his framework, but they begin to stretch it. One important but often understated factor in this period is environmental unfamiliarity. European settlers encounter crops, climate conditions, and ecological systems that do not align with Mediterranean experience. Food sources must be learned rather than assumed. Weather patterns differ in intensity and rhythm. Disease and fatigue become persistent challenges. These conditions make the idea of sustained occupation more difficult than initial optimism suggested. At the same time, the search for valuable resources intensifies. Gold, in particular, becomes a central focus of inquiry, not because it is abundant in a European sense, but because it functions as a universal marker of value within European economic systems. Reports of small quantities encourage further exploration and deeper engagement with inland regions, often without full understanding of local social or environmental consequences. The Taino communities respond to the presence of settlers in ways shaped by their own cultural frameworks, which include established systems of exchange, diplomacy, and social hierarchy. However, these systems are not fully understood by the newcomers, leading to repeated misinterpretation of intent on both sides. What may be perceived as cooperation in one context can be interpreted as obligation or compliance in another. As months pass, the fragile balance of the settlement begins to reveal structural weaknesses. Supply shortages, disagreements among the crew, and the difficulty of maintaining authority in a distant and unfamiliar environment create growing instability. The initial sense of discovery gradually shifts toward the realities of administration and survival. Columbus's position becomes increasingly complicated. He is both explorer and governor, interpreter and enforcer, acting within a space where no established colonial framework yet exists to guide decision-making. Each action carries consequences not only for immediate survival, but also for the broader interpretation of what this new world represents. Yet even as challenges emerge, the underlying assumption remains intact. These lands are still understood as part of a broader Asian periphery. The absence of contradiction is not complete enough to overturn the framework. Even if it is increasingly strained, geography, in this moment, is still flexible enough to accommodate uncertainty. What is beginning to take shape, however, is something larger than Columbus's initial voyage. The encounter between Europe and the Caribbean world is no longer a single event of discovery. It is becoming a sustained contact zone, where differing systems of knowledge, value, and power are beginning to intersect in ways neither side fully comprehends. And within that unfolding intersection, the expedition moves from exploration into consequence, as the implications of presence begin to extend far beyond the act of arrival itself. The return voyage to Spain does not feel like an ending. It feels like a transfer of evidence, of belief, and of uncertainty carried across the same ocean that once separated imagination from reality. The ships leave the Caribbean not with clarity, but with fragments living witnesses, unfamiliar objects, and reports that must now be interpreted by a court that never saw the land itself. On board, the atmosphere is different from the outbound journey. The terror of open water has been replaced by something quieter, though no less complex reflection. The crew has crossed the Atlantic and returned, and that fact alone reshapes what is considered possible. Yet the meaning of what they have found remains unresolved. They have encountered land, but not the Asia they were expecting. They have seen people, but not the civilizations described in European geographical tradition. Columbus carries with him a carefully constructed narrative of discovery. He describes the islands as part of the outer regions of Asia, consistent with his original framework. This interpretation is not merely personal conviction, it is strategic. In the political and intellectual context of late 15th century Europe, a discovery gains value not only from what is found, but from how it is classified. If these lands are framed as part of Asia, then the voyage becomes a direct route to established global trade systems rather than the discovery of an entirely unknown continent. Alongside him are indigenous individuals taken from the islands, brought to Spain as living evidence of the voyage. Their presence introduces a complex and often overlooked dimension. To the return they become both witnesses and symbols, interpreted through European expectations rather than understood within their own cultural context. Their existence in the court of Spain forces abstraction into physical reality, though not necessarily into accurate understanding. The reception in Spain is immediate and intense. News of land across the Western Ocean spreads quickly through political and intellectual circles. For many, the most important fact is not the exact nature of the islands, but the confirmation that a transoceanic route exists at all. This alone challenges long-standing assumptions about the boundaries of the known world. Yet even in this moment of recognition, uncertainty persists. The geographical identity of the newly encountered lands is still unclear. Are they part of Asia, as Columbus insists, or something else entirely? The available evidence does not yet resolve the question. Distances, descriptions, and comparisons remain insufficient to fully align the discovery with existing maps of the world. The Spanish monarchy, however, responds with pragmatic interest. Regardless of classification, the lands represent potential routes for trade, expansion of influence, and access to resources previously beyond reach. The distinction between Asia and new lands becomes secondary to the strategic advantage of presence in the Atlantic. This moment marks a subtle but profound shift. The voyage is no longer evaluated purely as a navigational achievement. It becomes a geopolitical event. The ocean crossing has demonstrated feasibility, and feasibility is enough to justify further investment. Additional expeditions are planned almost immediately, expanding the scale of engagement beyond what Columbus originally led. Within Europe, interpretations begin to diverge. Some view the voyage as confirmation of a westward route to Asia. Others begin to suspect that what has been found may not fit existing geographical models at all. However, without comprehensive mapping or full exploration of the newly encountered regions, no consensus emerges. The evidence remains incomplete, and competing interpretations coexist. Columbus himself remains committed to his original framework. He continues to assert that the islands belong to the outskirts of Asia, a position that shapes subsequent reports and influences early European understanding of the region. This interpretation will persist for years, even as further expeditions gradually complicate it. One often overlooked consequence of the return voyage is the way it transforms expectations of distance. What once seemed impossible, a sustained ocean crossing, has now been accomplished. This changes not only geography, but imagination itself. The Atlantic is no longer a barrier at the edge of maps. It is a traversable space, capable of connecting worlds previously thought separate. Yet this transformation is incomplete. Knowledge has expanded, but not stabilized. The world has become larger in some respects and smaller in others, depending on how it is measured. The Atlantic is now known, but what lies beyond it remains partially misidentified. As Columbus returns to Spain, he does not bring closure to geographical uncertainty. Instead, he brings acceleration. His voyage opens a pathway that will soon be repeated, expanded, and contested. The encounter between Europe and the Caribbean world is no longer a singular event, it is becoming a continuous process. And within that process, the question that will slowly emerge is not simply what has been found, but what it means that the world is not arranged in the way it was once believed to be. The court's reaction does not settle into a single narrative. Instead, it fractures into competing interpretations that reflect the intellectual instability of the age. Columbus is received not merely as a returning navigator, but as a figure who has disturbed the boundaries of known geography. Yet the nature of that disturbance is still unclear. What he has found is undeniable in physical terms, but its meaning remains suspended between competing frameworks. In the royal court, the emphasis quickly shifts from doubt to opportunity. Spain now possesses a foothold across the Atlantic, regardless of what those lands are ultimately classified as. This transforms the voyage from a speculative expedition into a political asset. The existence of reachable lands changes strategic calculations across Iberian politics. What was once considered theoretical becomes actionable. Columbus is rewarded with titles, honours, and authority over future expeditions. Yet these rewards carry an implicit tension. They are based on a version of his narrative that has not yet been proven correct in full. He's elevated not because his geographical model has been confirmed, but because his success has created a new space for interpretation. In this sense, his authority is both strengthened and quietly unstable. Outside the court, scholarly debate begins to intensify. Geographers and cosmographers attempt to reconcile the newly reported lands with existing maps. Some insist that these islands must be extensions of Asia's eastern edges, arguing that the world's scale may still fit traditional models with minor adjustments. Others begin to suspect a more radical possibility that a previously unknown continental mass exists between Europe and Asia, unaccounted for in classical geography. This disagreement is not immediately resolvable. The available data is too limited, the exploration too incomplete. No one yet has a full map of the Caribbean region, and no one has traversed enough of the surrounding waters to define its boundaries. As a result, interpretation remains open, shaped as much by intellectual tradition as by observation. Meanwhile, preparations begin for subsequent voyages. These expeditions are larger, more structured, and more explicitly aimed at expanding Spain's presence in the Atlantic. The initial uncertainty of Columbus's first journey is replaced by institutional momentum. What began as a single exploratory gamble is now becoming a sustained program of expansion. On the islands themselves, conditions begin to change more visibly. Spanish presence increases, bringing greater demands on local resources and labour. The initial phase of curiosity and exchange begins to give way to structured extraction and settlement planning. The fragile balance of early contact is replaced by growing asymmetry in power and expectation. A lesser-known aspect of this transition is the speed at which administrative frameworks are improvised. There is no pre-existing colonial system designed for this type of transoceanic expansion. Instead, governance structures are built reactively, adapting European legal and political concepts to a completely different environmental and social context. This improvisation creates inconsistencies that will shape the trajectory of future colonial development. Columbus's own position becomes increasingly complicated. While he retains formal authority, his interpretation of the lands he has encountered begins to diverge from emerging observations made by others. Reports from subsequent expeditions introduce new details, larger landmasses, more complex societies, and geographical features that do not easily align with the idea of outlying Asian islands. These discrepancies accumulate slowly, without immediate resolution. Still, Columbus maintains his original framework. In his accounts, he continues to describe the region as part of Asia's broader periphery. This consistency is partly ideological, partly strategic, and partly rooted in the intellectual limits of available geographical models. To abandon the framework entirely would require not only new data, but a complete restructuring of how the world is conceptualized. What emerges during this period is a growing gap between classification and reality. The lands are real, the encounters are real, but their categorization remains unstable. This instability does not prevent action. Instead, it enables expansion under conditions of uncertainty. Exploration continues precisely because the world has not yet been fully defined. In Europe, the idea of a transoceanic world begins to take hold, but not in a unified form. Different thinkers interpret the same events in different ways. Some see confirmation of classical geography, others see its limits. Still others begin to imagine entirely new global structures, though these ideas remain speculative. And within this evolving intellectual landscape, Columbus's voyage becomes something larger than its origin. It is no longer simply a journey that reached land. It is a disruption in the structure of global knowledge, forcing a re-evaluation of distance geography and the relationship between known and unknown space. What has been opened is not just a route across the ocean, but a period of sustained uncertainty in how the world itself is understood. Distance, once measured as a problem of travel, begins to transform into a problem of interpretation. The early reports from successive voyages do not resolve uncertainty, they multiply it. Each expedition adds new coastlines, new islands, new variations of geography that resist simple classification. What was once thought to be a small group of outlying islands near Asia now appears more extensive, more complex, and less consistent with established models. As Spanish presence expands in the Caribbean, so too does the accumulation of contradictory evidence. Explorers describe large land masses that cannot easily be reconciled with the idea of peripheral Asian territory. River systems, ecological diversity, and the sheer scale of some regions begin to strain the original framework Columbus used to interpret his discoveries. Yet institutional understanding does not shift immediately. Knowledge, in this period, does not reorganize itself quickly. It accumulates unevenly, layer by layer. Columbus remains committed to his original geographical interpretation for a considerable time. In his reports, he continues to refer to the region as part of Asia, or adjacent island systems connected to it. This persistence is not simply personal conviction, it reflects the limitations of available alternatives. To recognise an entirely separate continental mass would require a conceptual leap that no established European map yet supports. The world, as it is known, still has no clearly defined space for what is being encountered. However, other voices begin to emerge. Navigators, officials, and later explorers bring back accounts that complicate the original narrative. Some note that distances between land masses do not match expectations derived from Asian geography. Others observe cultural and environmental patterns that do not correspond to known regions of the East. These discrepancies accumulate gradually, creating pressure on existing models without immediately replacing them. A lesser-known dimension of this period is the role of administrative record-keeping. Reports sent back to Spain are not neutral documents. They are shaped by the priorities, assumptions, and interpretive frameworks of their authors. Language choices matter. Describing a land as an island versus a continent is not merely semantic. It determines how that land is understood politically, economically, and geographically. Over time, these descriptions influence how reality itself is organised in official records. Meanwhile, on the ground, colonial expansion introduces new layers of complexity. The initial phase of exploration gives way to systems of labour, governance, and resource extraction. These systems develop unevenly, often improvising structures from existing European institutions that were never designed for transoceanic administration. This creates tensions between intended order and practical reality. Local populations experience these changes in ways that are immediate and irreversible. European arrival alters trade networks, resource distribution, and social structures across multiple islands. The imbalance of power becomes increasingly formalised, not just through technology, but through organisation and sustained presence. What began as contact evolves into transformation of entire regional systems. Within Europe, intellectual debates continue to intensify. The core question shifts from whether the voyage succeeded to what, exactly, has been discovered. The assumption that these lands are part of Asia becomes harder to maintain as more information accumulates. Yet alternative explanations remain incomplete. The idea of a previously unknown continental system begins to gain gradual attention, though it lacks immediate consensus. Columbus's position becomes increasingly paradoxical. He is recognised as the initiator of transoceanic discovery, yet the interpretation of what he has discovered begins to drift away from his own framework. His authority is tied to the success of the voyage, but not necessarily to the evolving understanding of its meaning. Over time, this creates a subtle separation between achievement and interpretation. Political structures respond more quickly than intellectual ones. Spain continues to invest in expansion, driven by strategic advantage rather than geographical certainty. The Atlantic is no longer a boundary, but a field of opportunity. Even without full clarity about the nature of the lands encountered, their existence alone justifies continued engagement. As more expeditions follow, the gap between expectation and observation widens further. New coastlines do not conform neatly to earlier maps. Distances between regions do not match inherited calculations. And gradually, without a single decisive moment, the idea of a new world begins to take shape not as an official declaration, but as a slow convergence of evidence that resists older frameworks. What is unfolding is not just discovery, but reclassification. The world is not changing, but the understanding of it is, and that distinction will become increasingly important as exploration continues to expand beyond the limits of initial assumptions. The figure of Columbus, once centered in the narrative of discovery, begins to shift toward the margins of the world he helped expose, not because his voyages lose importance, but because the consequences of those voyages expand far beyond his original framework of understanding. What begins as a personal theory tested at sea becomes a structural transformation in how entire continents are perceived, mapped, and integrated into global systems. By the time further expeditions reinforce the existence of extensive landmasses across the Atlantic, the tension between interpretation and evidence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The idea that these territories are simply outlying regions of Asia requires more and more assumptions to remain intact. Distances do not align with expected geography. Ecological systems do not correspond to known Asian environments. Cultural observations, though filtered through limited understanding, resist simple classification. Each new piece of information adds weight to an emerging contradiction. Yet intellectual frameworks do not collapse instantly. They adjust slowly, often resisting replacement until a more complete alternative is available. In the case of the Atlantic discoveries, that alternative is not immediately clear. The concept of an entirely separate continental system exists only in fragments, proposed tentatively by some thinkers, but not yet universally accepted. As a result, two interpretations coexist, one that extends traditional geography with modifications, and another that begins to hint at a fundamentally different global structure. Columbus remains attached to the first of these interpretations. His reports continue to describe the lands as part of a broader Asian geography, a position that shapes early European documentation of the region. This persistence is not simply refusal to change, it reflects the intellectual environment of the time, where classical authority and inherited models still carry significant weight. To fully abandon them would require not just new data, but a reorganization of geographical thought itself. Meanwhile, Spanish expansion accelerates. Subsequent voyages bring larger fleets, more structured administrative oversight, and increasingly systematic efforts to map and control newly encountered territories. What began as exploratory contact becomes a sustained process of incorporation. The Atlantic is no longer a barrier or mystery. It is a corridor of movement connecting Europe to a region whose full scope is still not understood. A lesser-known aspect of this period is how rapidly information becomes institutionalized, even while still uncertain. Maps are drawn and redrawn, often incorporating speculative geography alongside verified coastlines. Official reports blend observation with assumption, creating hybrid representations of the world that are both accurate and incomplete. These documents shape policy, navigation, and expectation simultaneously. On the ground, the consequences of sustained contact deepen. Indigenous societies across the Caribbean experience rapid disruption through shifting trade relationships, disease exposure, and the restructuring of local power dynamics. These changes are not uniform, but they are cumulative. The arrival of European expeditions introduces new pressures that existing systems were not designed to absorb at such scale or speed. Within Spain, Columbus's status becomes increasingly complex. He is honoured for initiating the voyage that opened Atlantic expansion, yet his interpretations are gradually overtaken by new information and new actors. Later navigators and administrators contribute more detailed geographical knowledge, slowly refining or replacing earlier assumptions. The world that is being mapped no longer depends solely on his framework, even if it originated from his initiative. This creates a subtle but important historical shift. Columbus remains central to the origin of transoceanic contact, but not to the final structure of the knowledge that emerges from it. His role is foundational rather than definitive. He initiates a process whose outcomes exceed his own conceptual boundaries. As understanding evolves, the idea of a new world begins to stabilize not as a poetic expression, but as a practical necessity for distinguishing newly encountered lands from the known geography of Europe, Africa, and Asia. This terminology reflects a growing recognition that the Atlantic discoveries cannot be fully contained within older models. The world, as previously understood, is insufficient to describe the world that is now being charted. Yet even this recognition develops gradually. There is no single moment when the shift becomes complete. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of corrected maps, revised reports, and expanded expeditions that collectively redefine global geography. The process is incremental, uneven, and shaped by many contributors beyond Columbus himself. In this unfolding transformation, Columbus's story begins to transition from active discovery to historical origin point. The voyages remain central, but their meaning is no longer fixed. They become the starting condition for a much larger reconfiguration of global knowledge, one that continues long after his direct involvement diminishes. And within that larger process, the question of what was truly discovered becomes less about a single journey across the ocean, and more about the gradual realization that the world was larger, more complex, and differently arranged than any of its participants initially understood. In the final years of his life, Columbus exists within a world that has already begun moving beyond the framework he helped establish. The ocean he crossed remains the same physical space, but its meaning has shifted dramatically. It is no longer a boundary between continents, it is a connector of them. And yet, the full implications of that connection are still unfolding in ways that no single participant can fully control or understand. Columbus himself continues to insist on his original interpretation that the lands he encountered are part of the broader Asian periphery. Even as new voyages expand geographical knowledge and begin to outline a much larger and more complex Atlantic world, he remains anchored to the conceptual model formed during his earliest calculations. This persistence reflects not only personal conviction, but also the intellectual constraints of his time, where inherited geography still holds authority even in the face of contradictory evidence. Meanwhile, the reality of the lands across the Atlantic becomes increasingly difficult to fit into older systems of classification. The expanding body of exploration reveals vast territories, diverse ecosystems, and extensive coastlines that cannot be easily reconciled with existing maps of Asia. Gradually, without a single decisive break, the understanding of these regions shifts toward recognition of an entirely separate continental system. The idea of a new world is no longer speculative, it becomes necessary. This transition does not happen cleanly. It is layered, uneven, and shaped by competing interpretations. Some continue to use older terminology out of habit or institutional inertia. Others adopt new frameworks that better match observed geography. The result is a period of overlapping understandings, where the same lands are described in different ways depending on who is doing the describing and for what purpose. A lesser-known dimension of this transformation is how deeply it depends on accumulation rather than revelation. There is no single discovery that replaces the old world with the new one. Instead, there are hundreds of incremental observations, distances that do not align, maps that require constant revision, ecological systems that resist familiar categorization. Over time, these small inconsistencies build into a larger structural shift in understanding. Columbus's personal trajectory also reflects this broader pattern. Once the central figure of Atlantic exploration, he gradually becomes less influential in shaping the evolving interpretation of the lands he helped bring into European awareness. Later navigators, administrators, and cartographers contribute more detailed and accurate representations of geography, slowly redefining the conceptual boundaries of the known world. His role remains foundational, but no longer authoritative. In Spain and across Europe, the consequences of transatlantic expansion continue to unfold. Trade networks begin to reorganize around newly accessible routes, political strategies shift in response to overseas territories, economic systems gradually expand to incorporate resources and regions that had not previously been part of European calculation. The Atlantic becomes not a limit, but a central axis of emerging global interaction. Yet beneath these large-scale transformations lies a quieter, more complex truth: the world did not suddenly change, but its understanding did. The land masses were always there, existing independently of European awareness. What changed was the framework through which they were perceived, mapped, and integrated into human knowledge. Discovery, in this sense, is not creation, but recognition under conditions of limited understanding. As Columbus's life draws to a close, his story settles into a paradox that history never fully resolves. He is remembered as the initiator of one of the most significant geographical transformations in human history, yet he never fully reconciles the nature of what he has found with the evolving evidence that follows. His vision opens a pathway, but the path leads beyond the boundaries of his own interpretation. In the long arc of history, the Atlantic crossing becomes a turning point not because it answers questions, but because it exposes how many questions remain unresolved. The world expands not only in physical knowledge, but in conceptual complexity. New continents are not just added to maps, they require new ways of thinking about distance, connection, and the structure of the globe itself. And in the end, the untold story of Columbus is not only about a voyage across an ocean, it is about the moment when certainty and uncertainty collided on a global scale, and the realization slowly emerged that the world had always been larger than the maps that attempted to contain it. The ocean remains, as it always was, unchanged in substance, but forever altered in meaning by those who crossed it and those who followed after.